everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Gender Trap. I'm your host, David Parsons, joined by Yasmin Nair. How you doing, Yasmin?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you.
I am psyched to have a space to speak with you about a subject that, we talk about class as like this central thing so much, but to me, when I start thinking about gender, I see it everywhere, and that's part of why I thought today we could sort of describe why we think gender is important. But also, I don't know, like you're a voice who's someone who, you've been writing and thinking about gender for a long time and starting organizations around gender and ideas of equality and gay marriage. And I feel like it would be nice to have a space where we can actually, I don't want to use the term safe space, but a place where we can like sort of play with these ideas. Because to me, like I think the gender trap idea is in part the notion that none of this is settled, and that there's a lot of orthodoxies that I'd like to interrogate and maybe talk ourselves into some corners and maybe out of some corners with this stuff. But I wonder, like, if you would use this term, Yasmin, like, because you've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, but we're in this, like, right now in 2022, it feels like gender panic, gender hysteria. It's definitely like a subject that's driving people nuts and is part of, for whatever reason, the engine of politics, and like the left and right throwing red meat at their base when it comes to transgender stuff. I know we'll get into like J.K. Rowling, everything. It's all out there. But it's a weird moment, right?
It is, well, okay, so it is a weird moment, and to me, it's also not a weird moment. I think it seems like it's a lot more hyper intense right now, I think, the conversations.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with, and I know this is sort of a cliched point, but I think it's necessary to make, which is a lot of that does have to do with the onslaught of social media platforms, just the hyper, and also I think the very drastically different media landscape we're in right now. So, which is to say, news organizations, whether they be the storied New York Times or your local, neighborhood rag, and I'm very fortunate to live in a neighborhood that actually has a neighborhood newspaper called the Hyde Park Herald, so a big shout out there. But I think the fact that media now is always looking for clickbait of some sort,
right,
and amplifies even the smallest niggling of people into some wide controversy. So on a slightly unrelated note, I will note, for instance, that you may have seen this as well, yesterday and the day before, actually more like yesterday, for about 3 hours perhaps, there was talk about the Steve Martin, famous 1978 Steve Martin's King Tut routine, which, if anyone has not seen it, you need to watch it, and you need to watch it with the introduction where he talks about why he did. But then on Twitter, everyone's like, oh, now people are trying to cancel Steve Martin. No one said that, actually. And so I went back today, this morning, to look and say, who's yes, at some point, I think in 2017 at Reed College, there was some organization that said this is problem, whatever. But right now, as of, from let's say 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Chicago Standard Time on Twitter, there were no arguments, and there still aren't. But I think, there was this pumping up, and that's what the algorithm, there's this weird. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that gender has always been a part of, there's always been a gender panic, always. I do think that queerness, right, the centuries old, which is what my comrade Ryan Conrad began the Against Equality group as a website, precisely to document the ways in which queer politics has been radical all throughout, and to point out that gay marriage, for instance, was never something that queers actually have wanted historically, right? But when you look at that long history, you realize one of the things you do realize is that a lot of the queer panic is actually around gender, because it is about men daring to bend down and take it in the ass. That's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say it's a gendered panic. So I think gender has always been with us. And of course, there's race and there's class, but gender somehow always manages to make, the police brutality case the many infamous police
Mm-hmm.
brutality cases in New York, for instance, which are about inserting objects like
Right.
brooms,
Yep.
right, into Ahmadullah's ass, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is a gendered form of brutality. It is not any coincidence. It is about placing a Black man in also as a woman, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, I feel like womanness, and I don't want, again, we need to talk about, obviously, we need to talk about trans issues, but even within that, I think the place of woman is also the place of ultimate degradation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's something that I'm. We have so much to talk about, and this is part of why I didn't want this to just be like 1 hour podcast. I just felt like this is a sort of like an endless thing, and connects to, I don't know, nostalgia trap, which sort of like think about our own personal histories. And I grew up as a kid that was just sort of like bullied by my older brothers who were very like alpha male. They have big trucks. They're sort of like athletic. I was like, I ended up being like a grad student, PhD type, and so like, what is the path of humiliation? And the path of humiliation was always, faggot and woman and girl and pussy and all of the words, all of the sort of direction of the humiliation. And the sort of like what I see as policing masculinity has to do with the contrast with the woman who is the hated thing or the thing you don't want to be. Yeah, for sure. And that in a transgender moment is really interesting to me, because it feels like
Mm-hmm.
that's why, in part, why transgender, the idea of transgender people drives the right crazy, like completely
Mm-hmm.
insane, because it fucks with that whole balance.
Right, right. And we have to talk about that, but I also wanted to think just briefly about what you said about becoming a grad student. And I
Yeah.
think you were a grad student in history. Actually, you were in film, right, originally?
History and film. Yep.
You're history and film, you're a film and history scholar, right? And I was in an English department. And as writers in particular, again, I would say, forgive the sort of blanket term, but for centuries, writers have always battled against the effeminization of their profession, which is why you have, especially in the 20th century, you have all these writers doing the whole, Bukowski, all of them taking on the persona of the rugged writer, the guy who snorts drugs all the time and has a lot of sex and is on the road, literally, right? Kerouac, that whole tradition.
Shoots lions.
Ginsberg,
Yeah.
right, exactly. Ginsberg coyly steps out of that tradition and says, actually, I'm just a fag. But, but by and large, going to an English department made me realize how many of the men around me were so obsessed with asserting their masculinity because they were already in the sort of feminized profession and feminized discipline. So I think that's how even the intellectual life that we want to pursue ends up trapping us really
Yeah.
in these gender formations. And as far as trans stuff is concerned, I'm so glad that we're doing this on a regular basis, because I really want us to get in culture to get to a point where we can talk about trans matters without being entrapped by friggin' J.K. Rowling. It's
Yeah.
I feel like trans issues now are always under that umbrella of Rowling. Even when we're talking about, for instance, the horrific things happening in Texas and now spreading to other places, it's always in terms of these stupid battles about one of the richest women in the world who literally lives in a castle and can afford to just, I don't know, lie
Yeah, no,
back and
I
enjoy
totally
your
agree,
cat.
and that's part of why I wanted to do this show with you, Yasmin, is because you're the type of person who often pushes back against sort of left orthodoxy or just the sloganeering, just the idea
Right.
that, well, since J.K. Rowling is this villain, I have to speak these words and say these things. In other words, it's all kind of like a trap of discourse, and a trap
It
of like
is.
what we have to say in order to let everyone know that we're on the right side of things. When to me, I think we can just assume we're on the right side of things, and let's just talk our way through it. You know what I mean? Like,
I like that. Exactly. Like, why can't we just have good faith in the fact that, yeah, actually, no, I don't have to perform my anti J.K. Rowling stance. I don't have to burn her books. I enjoy her books. I enjoy the movies. I plan on doing so for many years to come. And it's fun. One of my favorite writers is Enid Blyton, whom some people will know, depending on their generation. Terribly racist writer, but incredibly delightful. I read
mm-hmm.
She's an English children's book writer who wrote more books than anyone can count, I think. But yeah, I mean, what does J.K. Rowling have to do with inciting trans stuff outside of Twitter? And what does she do more than provide perhaps a kind of a semi-career for some people?
Right.
And I would include many trans people in that. I don't follow, for instance, and this will get me into some amount of trouble, but I don't follow Chase Strangier very much, a lot on Twitter. He's the ACLU lawyer, trans lawyer, who also speaks frequently. But it's getting on Twitter and there's a way in which that discourse doesn't really get us towards a moment of liberation. It does not help us strike down laws, for instance, that we might imagine so. But ultimately, what strikes down anti-trans laws is a lot of boots, on the ground.
Yeah.
It's a lot of talking to your politicians, making sure your politicians understand, listen, you do this, you're out of office the very next time, or you're out of office now even.
Well,
so, yeah, that it matters more than a Twitter handle.
I agree, and I think it was Ted Cruz that asked Ketanji Jackson during the Supreme Court when she was applying for the job. He asked her, can you define a woman, right? And she was like, she basically declined to define a woman, which I thought was a really interesting moment, actually. And I'm sitting there being like, well, isn't that like that's partly what drives me crazy, is it's sort of like essentializing ideas, right? Sort of like, what is a woman? Tell me what it is. Like,
right.
in 3 words, it's like, well, it's a woman is a person with a uterus, like there's all these sort of like strict, right. And all of it starts to break down the closer you get to it, right? I thought that was a brilliant moment from her, actually,
right.
To not define that. But I also understand that drives people fucking nuts. Like, it seems like, I mean, I sent you that piece from the Financial Times, "No Country for Young Men," which is an interesting piece for people that don't know this, didn't see this piece. I can link it with the episode. But it was responding to the Tucker Carlson testicle tanning thing, which is almost too ridiculous to even comment on. But it was sort of like, the article brings up the Hemingway sort of like the over-determined man, the guy who's just like, yeah, we get it. There's almost this idea that you're performing this intense masculinity, and maybe because there's an anxiety there, right? But he also, I wondered what you thought about this piece, because it was like he was talking about a European sort of model of masculinity, and he said like Emmanuel Macron is actually a model of masculinity, but Americans would never, like right-wing Americans would never think that. They would they would sort of dismiss that European masculinity as effete. That's like the worst thing. This writer was sort of like tearing his hair out over the idea that there's a right-wing sort of hysteria about masculinity right now that goes to those really like basic places, like big trucks, guns, etc. It seems like there's a real like kind of fake performance of American masculinity that seems functional on the right now, and Tucker Carlson is kind of fanning those flames.
Right. He talks about a richer notion of masculinity that U.S. conservatives have thrown aside for footage of men launching spears and slurping raw eggs. I mean, this is a guy who's clearly based in Europe. So and it's interesting. It's necessary, I think, to note that he's also a brown person. He's a brown man.
I noticed that.
I think, right. With him, I also see a certain class background. And I think Americans in particular don't get the ways in which brown identity can collude or, combine with a certain class background. I haven't looked at his bio very carefully, but, there's a certain kind of upper class brown person who travels very easily in Europe and who is probably genuinely puzzled by the American notion of masculinity. But I don't think he's at all, I don't know what Europe he's talking about precisely, because I think about football culture in England.
Sure, yeah.
Which is literally
fucking
it's a deathly form of masculinity.
Those guys are way tougher than the American football fans, I feel like.
fucking frightening, man. I mean, yeah, get them angry in a bar in America, and you should just run. Don't
One time
walk.
I was in a bar on the Upper East Side in New York, just me and my friend, and we had the karaoke machine to ourselves, and there was no one else there. It was like a rainy Tuesday night. All of a sudden, like this fucking rugby team came in, like a bunch of Irish dudes or British dudes, and it was just like a fucking Guy Ritchie movie in there. All of a sudden, there were like, and we're usually pretty social. We want to play darts with everyone, but we kind of took the mood of the room that we had to get the fuck out of there.
Dude, rugby. Listen, I went to what is actually, it's a complicated situation. It was a school founded by a Frenchman. There are three of them in Lyon, Calcutta, and in Lucknow. But it was run in the British style. So we had a rugby team. Let me tell you, our rugby team lost people to death. I mean, rugby is, and this is in an upper class environment. And in fact, the more upper class, in fact, rugby, the more it gets, the more intensely violent it gets. Rugby is deeply violent as a sport.
Well, yeah, we should definitely get into like sports, nationalism, masculinity. I mean, those things intersect deeply,
and
right?
This guy, and the thing that interests me, and the thing that interests me about this, I look at him and I go, sweetie, come on now. What are you saying? What kind of European high life are you living that you can pretend that there isn't? Also, look at what just happened in France, right? I mean, the nationalism, the intense nationalism, the intense hatred, the Islamophobia.
Well,
right?
it feels like what you're pointing out is that this guy is more upset with the sort of brute style. The like sort of it is sort of a
darling, don't
classist.
show it. Right. Don't show your violence. Don't show your Islamophobia so clearly. Can you not be more delicate about it? I'm like, dude, you're a brown guy. You know damn well when you walk down the street in many parts of England, that you are treated with violence, or perhaps you're not, because you occupy. And he's writing for the Financial Times. Listen, my dream is to be able to afford a subscription to the Financial Times, but it is like so many hundreds of dollars. And if I can't afford it, I'm going to have to go downstairs and tell them, listen, when that paper comes in, that pink paper, you need to put it under lock and key because it is so expensive. I can't afford to lose a single issue. So, he's writing for the bloody Financial Times. He's writing from a very privileged position. And of course, he's right about the masculinity portrayed in the Tucker Carlson trailer.
Sure.
But I'm like, where do you come off pretending that this is somehow there's a European, better?
Well, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like Alec Baldwin in 2000, whatever, being like, if George W. Bush is reelected, I'm moving to France. And it's like, what the fuck? Like, moving to France, where everything's great, and they don't have racism, and they don't have inequality, and they don't have shitty schools and depressing consumer worlds. I mean, I think a lot fooling yourself into thinking Western Europe is some escape from the fucking nastiness of American culture is kind of weird, especially because Western Europe has gotten more and more like America over the last, I would say, 20, 30 years, right? Like globalization has made it so like, that's a funny idea. And there is some of that in that. I'm glad you brought like pop culture, because that's part of what we want to talk about on this show too. You and I like to gossip about pop culture and like, well, what does a man look like? Well, Jason Momoa, right? Like,
thank you. The obligatory Jason Momoa reference has entered the room. Yes.
I just watched Aquaman last week.
So
I'm like,
great.
and I'm like,
so beautiful.
What do we mean by masculinity when we apply that to Jason Momoa? Because I feel like he's a guy that people point to and be like, "That's a man." You know what I mean? And he's a different kind of guy than
he
like.
Is, yeah. Someone on Twitter said, or somewhere, I love Twitter because it is so funny. Like there are people who can't write for shit. Ask them to write a essay, they can't write for shit, but ask them to post tweets every hour on the hour. They're brilliant at it. And someone said Jason Momoa is basically your cool radical boyfriend. And it's true. Mm-hmm. He is. So he's a man for the 21st, for this part of the 21st century, the first quarter of the he's cool. He's the guy who will take you, whatever, surfing. But he also is very, very environmentally conscious, right? He's all about the wolves as well, saving the wolves, saving the mountain in Hawaii. He's like your cool rat boyfriend, and he is, may I just say, the embodiment of human perfection. He's
Well,
also interestingly raced. I don't know. I think
yeah.
I
Oh,
don't know if you
totally.
and I
I'm
have
like, he's one of
talked
those
about
guys. I
this.
mean, there is a sort of like pan-ethnic thing going on in
Yeah,
Hollywood
he's
right
the first
now.
brown. Yeah, he's the first brown Superman, which he has consistently tried to point out, but people ignoring it because I think they just don't want to realize it. I'm like, he's brown. His father is Hawaiian and his mother is white, from Idaho, I want to say. I should know this, right? But the funny thing is, if you look at him, you don't see either one of his parents in him. It's like all their DNA kind of mixed and matched and did interesting. He's also like way taller than either one of them.
He looks like the
It's really
future. He looks like
interesting.
the future, like
Right.
the next step in human evolution, right?
Which is why I always say about Jason Momoa, when the aliens come, right, and they're about to blast us to pieces because what the hell have you guys done anyway? We can just wheel out Jason Momoa and they'll be like, oh, okay, you achieved perfection. You're okay for the next 300 years.
You know what I think is really funny about that? Because I'm thinking about pop culture history and everything that all the images that I've been subjected to in my life. One of the stories that comes up in my family a lot is that my mom went to go see a taping of the Sonny and Cher program, and Alan Alda was the guest, and Alan Alda asked my mom out on a date, and that's like, and she said no because she was married. But that story alone is something we talk about in our family that Alan Alda asked her out. But I bring up Alan Alda because he was on the cover of magazines in the 70s and everything. It was like he was the model of like the new age sensitive male, and then there was like I'm just doing a fast flash through this history because that sensitive new age male was real popular for a bit, but then there was like this backlash in the 80s of like Sylvester Stallone, Schwarzenegger, all these huge fucking muscle guys. And Jason Momoa is sort of like the porridge in the center, right? He seems like the guy that like combines the like thing we want, like a sensitive new age guy, but also this like muscly dude that can like, rip a car apart and be a model of like what a physical specimen a man can be. That's interesting to me that like Momoa is like the He's the sort of synthesis of these tendencies in male culture. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And it's also, I think that for that reason, and this is why I think we like talking about popular culture, because there is a history to all of this, right? And the history of Jason Momoa is that, a lot of people think, oh, he just popped up with Aquaman. Actually, he's been in film and television for over 20 years. If you see pictures of him
in Baywatch.
He looks like a young, crabby white guy. There is no trace. I'm not even sure what happened. I'm like, your skin just, what is going on here? Your hair, everything about you is different.
He looks better when he gets old. I feel like a lot of men,
lot of people,
and I think women, it happens with women too. They don't look right until they're like fully formed in their like 40s and 50s.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's true for all of us. I look at older photos of mine and I'm like, oh yeah, you were cute, but you're way better looking now.
I feel that way. I feel like my face looks like it wasn't fully baked, but it wasn't fully finished.
Right. But the thing about Momoa, right, is that he was actually hanging around in film and television for a very long time, even looking the way he does now. He did a ton of movies. He did a ton of, and then he did go, Game of Thrones. And he wasn't actually, and he was massively popular, but no one would hire him because he acted too well. So apparently everyone thought he couldn't actually speak English. And he did. And then I think he also kind of got typecast. So, everyone's like, oh, well, he's just, Dothraki. And so, but the point I guess I'm trying to make is that in terms of that look and that kind of masculinity, and to be fair, Momoa as Dothraki was very hyper masculine as well. But he wasn't, he wasn't evident to us, right? Until a certain moment after Game of Thrones, Aquaman. And I think Aquaman also, that history is interesting because Aquaman himself, as people know, the old cartoon was of this very strange looking white dude with very yellow blonde hair riding on a tiny dolphin. I mean, that was the original Aquaman. And then you get this multicultural, pumped up perfectly gorgeous Jason Momoa.
Well, it feels like it's also beyond his work. It's like I feel like that he became a sort of viral star in the same way that almost like Nicolas Cage is or something, like where there's a lot of images that people just love him online. And one of the things that I think for me, like I came to awareness of Momoa through realizing that, oh, like he's married to Lisa Bonet, and he has this bromance with Lenny Kravitz, who was also with Lisa Bonet, and they have children together, and there's this like happy mixed family, and it almost seems like Lisa Bonet has two husbands, and they're both gorgeous, and it's like this kind of, I think that definitely drove the sort of like mystique around Momoa as like this bro guy who seems like he's beyond the bro. He's sort of like not a possessive person, obviously. Like him and Lenny Kravitz are friends, and like all of it seemed like there's a social media character of Jason Momoa too.
Right. And he and Lenny Kravitz have just declared. It was sort of interesting that they declared their bromance once again after the divorce as well. And it seemed like a public statement. And I found that a very interesting public statement, because usually, as we know, right, celebrity divorces include public statements that are all about, yes, we still love each other through kind of gritted teeth, right? We still love each other. We have these children. But here you have a different kind of post, right? We live in California, so it's a 50%.
You're reminding me of the Governor McGreevey, when he announced he was gay, and his wife was there holding hands. Behind. And you're kind of like, what
the look on his wife's face, though, I still remember. She was just like staring right ahead. For those who don't remember, this is the guy who turned out to be gay, and who showed up with his wife at his side, looking straight ahead. I don't think her eyes ever moved to the left or to the right. She just kept staring right above the heads. But anyway, the point about Momoa and Kravitz, I think that's an interesting kind of post-divorce statement, which is it comes from the husband and the ex-husband of. And I give all credit, frankly, to Lisa Bonet for that. I'm like, you're an interesting woman.
She won life.
Have this around you,
Yeah, to have those.
Wow.
Those two dudes, beautiful kids. And she doesn't even have to really have an acting career at all.
Doesn't.
Like I literally know her.
Bonet.
Yeah, I know her from The Cosby Show and Angel Heart with Mickey Rourke and Robert De Niro. I don't know if you've seen that one, but it's a devil worship movie. From
Right. No, she's not known for her acting career. She's known for being Lisa Bonet. I mean, and she, that's an interesting career in itself that probably warrants an entire podcast.
Oh yeah.
Just think about what does it mean to be Lisa Bonet? It's fascinating.
What does it mean to be Bill Cosby?
What does it mean to be Bill Cosby?
Well, it's funny that the other. I was thinking of another man that aged into his face and it was around for a long time, is John Hamm. And we should just, I think, be very straightforward with everyone and say that Mad Men, if we're doing a seminar here, you and I, Yasmin, like Mad Men is sort of a central text. And I feel like Sopranos too and other of those prestige shows, in part because they're sort of like markers of certain kind of views in the popular imagination of how gender works. But God, Mad Men is such a place to just quickly reference, the world of gender in the 50s and 60s, and how much has changed and how much has not changed. I love that you said you can only handle like 1 or 2 episodes at a time.
Oh God, yes.
Why is that? Because I find that fascinating, because I've watched these prestige shows like thousands of times over and over, but Mad Men I only watched once. Like I've never gone back to it, and I definitely plan on going back to some episodes as you and I do these episodes, because I still remember them. They stuck with me that much.
Amazing. So I think with Mad Men, it's just such an intense viewing experience. It's such an intense viewing experience. Each episode feels like watching The Godfather. It feels like a movie. Yeah, really. And there's a very definite beginning and an end. And even though, of course, the strands of the story are linked to what comes before and what comes after, there's an intensity to it. And I think a lot of that, that does, I think, have a lot to do with the masculinity of the show in a certain way. But I think it's also because it's an extraordinarily layered show. And it may have been in some ways, I think, quite the groundbreaker, because what you get is, but what I mean by layers is you have to start with, you have the walls, literally, of the places that they're all in, right? So you have those fantastic art pieces, right? You have the Rothko, you have the
Yeah.
Rothko, but you
Right.
also have in Don Draper's fair suburban house, you have that absolutely, mid to late 60s, that, those plaid wall, papered walls. You have, right? And then in front of them, you have these quintessential lamps, right? And then you have the couches in also that plaid and the shag carpeting. I guess the point of, and then you have the human beings in front of them in these extraordinary clothes. And by extraordinary, I don't just mean that they're beautiful, but that they are so precisely made to reflect what was worn at the time. And you can sense that, right? In the fact that I remember reading an interview with the costume designer who said that, the women on the show said, why do we have to wear bras? And she said, because these things all have dots. And if you don't wear a bra, the thing just does not fit well. They were made for wearing.
Yep.
Yeah, it does not hang. They were made for wearing with a certain kind of underwear. And so that extraordinarily detail, I think, is also, it lends itself to this extraordinary immersive experience.
But there's also like the fetishization of that stuff too. Isn't it interesting that
yes.
like mid-century modern, I mean, I'm in Southern California.
It made it hell. It made it hell to buy mid-century after that. I could find that shit in thrift stores before Mad Men for nothing. Forget it now.
Oh yeah, and I mean the same is true of a lot of things, and it's kind of interesting that like the show is ostensibly, I think you would agree, a pretty harsh critique of this era and these mad men, and yet the culture's response to it is interesting because it's like all of a sudden we have cocktail bars and guys want to dress this way and girls want, and like what the fuck, like this is sort of supposed to be a warning, let's not go back to this awful time, and yet at the same time, like I agree with you, I want to sit there. Part of me is like I want to be in this office with these guys. And that's
right.
Like, I mean, to me, there's the contradiction, right?
Well, there's Don Draper, and
I don't want to be one of the women in the show, just to be clear.
And that's what's interesting, right? Because women are treated like crap, but Don Draper makes his way through life. I've always said to people that I am Don Draper, and I know that sounds awful because then people look at me and go, he's an asshole for X, Y, but I know, and I said, yes, I know, but look at the way he moves through this world. And there is a psychoanalytic reading, and I hope we'll get to that, right? Which is the idea of forgetting and erasure and memory, which is really what the arc of the show is, right? It's about Draper's psychosis. It's his psychotic breakdown because of his having to maintain this constantly trying to forget when he cannot forget. But what's interesting, though, about the gender aspect is that just a couple of days ago, a friend of mine said that apparently John Hamm, by the way, another extraordinarily beautiful man, did an interview where he said, I don't know why people think, and I have to look this up and I'll find the link and send it to you. But apparently he said that I don't know why people think that Mad Men was about Don Draper, because it was actually about Peggy. And he says, Peggy was the main character. I was just a subsidiary who looked like the main character. But the show is actually about Peggy. So now as I watch it, I'm going to watch it with that in mind. And I can sort of see. And I also wonder if that's also in many ways explains the ways in which audiences lapped up the style of Mad Men.
Yeah.
And others among us, were obviously hooked into the narrative tensions and what we were gleaning from that. But I think there's a way in which the style distracted, perhaps.
Totally.
Also from the gendered aspect. So for John Hamm to say that, I think is extraordinary.
Yeah, and to me that's really key because it's key to what I want. I was thinking of all the directions we can go with this show, Yasmin, and it's a million different things. But one of them, obviously we have to talk about like sort of second wave feminism coming out of that era, because if Peggy is the hero of Mad Men, then sort of like this is sort of a girl boss corporate feminism. This is a little bit lean in the sense of what it seems like it's about. And I don't mean that the show is endorsing that idea. I just mean that the show is sort of like showing us that this is the direction it goes. That Peggy, in many ways, Peggy is the character that's like the sort of the Jason Momoa, the person that's sort of like taking those trends and capitalizing on the changes, and the sort of like the person that's, I guess your assumption is that Peggy's going to go on and be very successful in the business world, right? Like that's the assumption, that she will be that sort of like groundbreaking, Hillary Clinton, although Hillary Clinton, she's in the business world, she's in politics, but you know what I mean, a sort of figure of a successful professional white woman. And that direction in feminism is one that's been, I mean, a big subject of debate in terms of the like what that resulted in, right, and what that produced.
Mm-hmm. All of that, yes. And also, what's I think extraordinary about the show is how much I was talking about this with another friend of mine. I said, just watching what happens to these women. So, for instance, Joan gets raped by her fiance in Don's.
It's one of the most
office.
Disturbing episodes, I think, if not the most disturbing. Yeah,
absolutely. And just the ways in which women are treated in the office and so on. First of all, I don't think the show could be made today without all kinds of arrows pointing to, by the way, we mean this ironically, or we mean this, because I think the tendency nowadays is to not want representation without some sort of footnoting.
Or to do like the old Hays Code shit of like if you show an abhorrent behavior, it needs to be punished, or you need to if the movie or whatever the fuck needs to indicate that it knows it's wrong. In many ways, I feel like people want like a sort of like moral story. They want like almost like a religious story that tells you who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. And Mad Men presents a lot of contradictions and a lot of blurry places. Yeah, totally.
Whether in terms of race or certainly in terms of gender, you have women whose skirts are pulled up, who are chased around the office, and then their skirts are pulled up to see what color panties they're wearing and so on. And this is all done by the good guys in the show. There are no heinous villains in Mad Men.
And the most disturbing element for me, I don't know about for you, but watching these things happen and watching sort of understanding that the culture has not changed so that the women, to me, the most disturbing element is watching the women naturalize the behavior and sort of explain it away. And even Joan herself, who is raped by her husband, sort of doesn't even
really... fiancé at the time, actually, I think.
Right. Either way, she doesn't recognize it. She doesn't recognize it in the way that we recognize it. And to me, that is one of the most fucked up elements of watching Mad Men, is watching how much, oh my God, these people don't even get that it's fucked up, right? They don't even, or they get it on a subconscious level. They're certainly not talking about it in the way that people are going to just a few years later.
And they're also not in a social framework that allows for any kind of questioning. Whether it's because they're in their jobs and they need that job, Joan clearly needs that job, Peggy needs a job, etc. But there's no cultural discourse around that. I mean, there is. We know this now, of course, but it isn't seeping into this particular part of the world at all, right? So there's that issue, and so my friend and I was saying, what must it have been like in real life for the women that we know? For instance, his mother, who came up at that time. And he says, I just don't even ask, He said, there are things we just don't talk about. I have to, because, people whose mothers, for instance, came up through the office world at that time. I mean, can you imagine what it was like? It's just the persistence of rape. We talk about rape culture, but I really think it's much more useful to talk about the persistence of rape, period. We'd use words like rapey behavior now. And I'm like, yeah, but even now, if you're someone who's working in a low-paid crap job, Me Too hasn't benefited you at all. And what you're subjected to is not rapey behavior. What you're more likely than not subjected to is rape behavior, right? I mean, we have young women on the South Side, for instance, being pulled over by cops, being forced to give them blowjobs, being forced to have, penetrative sex and so on, for no rhyme or reason other than, well, this is, I just found someone and I can do this. So rape itself, I think, is still a fact of life. The prevalence of that may have gone away for a certain class and perhaps a certain racialized women, but it's still a fact of life. And I feel like Mad Men kind of makes it clear how much, honestly, just rape is just embedded, right, in our social relations. Rape and marriage.
Yeah, right. I mean, I was going to say that it's interesting that John Hamm would say Peggy is the sort of central figure, because in many ways I felt, especially towards the end, that Betty was a sort of like just what they put her through. And I mean, there weren't a lot of like, there weren't a lot of like too on the nose types of things on Mad Men where they were just really trying to like hammer this point home. But with Betty, I mean, the nightmare life that she has with the to me, like there are a couple different scenes that stand out, but like her, when she gives birth, there's like a very carceral hospital experience that's like a horror.
Yes.
And yeah, her life with Dawn, and then, you know, spoiler alert, you know, getting cancer at the end. Like all of it is
Right.
just a tragedy. I feel, and I'm always like, did they name her Betty because it's Betty Friedan? Like she's sort of like
Mm.
you know, the warning of the, you know, about the domestic housewife kind of thing. But
Right.
it's relentless with her. It's
It is
yeah,
relentless, right? And she gets cancer just as she decides to go back to school to
right,
get a degree, where she
right.
is brave enough to be, even though we meet her as this beautiful young Betty by the time we get to the end of the show, again, spoiler alert, she is the oldest student in a class full of, 20 somethings. So she's extraordinarily brave to go back to school, given her background. And but I think about her, and you think about Stepford Wives, the
Mm-hmm.
novel and the movie,
Yep.
both of which have very, very interesting histories that we can talk about someday. But if you talk, and Betty begins the series, right, within what is diagnosed as a form of psychosis,
Mm-hmm. That's right.
because she's in her psychiatrist's office, and then of course, as we know, it turns out that her psychiatrist rather, has actually been communicating his findings, quote unquote, to Dawn all the time. um, so and that again was actually something, yes, that did happen at the time, where there was women just had absolutely no autonomy. But Betty's
It's like
entire
taking someone to the husband
mm,
is like taking his dog to a
right.
vet. You know what I mean?
Yes, thank you. Yes,
And the doctor is talking.
exactly.
I mean, this is in my family. My when my wife, when she was born, her mom is a nurse. Her mom is literally a nurse. She's in the hospital giving birth, and they had to do an emergency C-section. And they said, "Hold on, we need to call your husband and get permission from him for this." She's a nurse. Her husband is not a nurse, has no medical knowledge whatsoever. He's on the phone. Yeah, do whatever you got to do. And they had to get permission. In other words, and it's like the idea that like that I don't think a lot of people, young people today, understand that how much marriage, what like, and property was tied together, and how much a
Yeah.
woman was a piece of property. Not just in like kind of a cultural, ideological way. You're my property, but literally written into all the legal structures, all the financial laws, all the laws
Mhm.
about medical care. And yeah, Betty in Mad Men, it's kind of fucking. That's a really upsetting moment early on when Dawn is on the phone with the doctor, and you're realizing, oh fuck, they're talking about Betty's health, and it's just between these two guys. Yeah.
It's just between the two men. Yeah, between us. What do you think is wrong with her? It's a dreadful thing, and she's a peculiar character. I mean, I'm watching the whole series, I think, for the third time. So I'm looking at her with some things in mind, including the fact that she's a pretty ghastly person in herself. She's a terrible person. She's a terrible mother,
The way
but
she
she's
treats her
also,
daughter is,
oh
yeah,
geez,
and it's
it's
clearly coming out of
awful.
like a jealousy. Yeah.
Right. And also partly, obviously, because her own relationship to her own mother, all of that, her father. But it's, yeah, what happens to Betty and what happens to all the different women in the show is interesting. And then at the center of it all is what is happening to Dawn. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of like it is a show about the white middle class, right? Like it seems like
right.
that's mainly because if I don't remember the show being
Well,
particularly strong on race and things like that. I was sort of like
no, no,
there were
oh,
some
no, not at
clumsy.
all.
I feel like
No.
there were some clumsy civil rights episodes where I was like, oof, like I can tell they want to do
Oh
something
yes,
here.
yes, yes. Like the one where what's her name? Peggy has a black coworker in her apartment, and there's this whole. I thought that was actually I saw that moment, and I saw, but again, maybe that was one of the stronger moments,
Yeah,
perhaps, when
right.
it becomes clear that they both have this moment where it's clear Peggy is trying to not seem suspicious about the fact that her purse is in the same room, and the black woman knows exactly what Peggy is thinking, and so on.
They tried to do a
Um,
little microaggression
yeah,
there. Yeah.
right, right, exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. No, it is interesting, and it's and then the famous blackface episode, which I'm glad they did not remove, unlike say a stupid show like Third Rock, which just went ahead and removed any racialized references, but Mad Men has left that part in and
That's
said
so
we
fucking weird
reflect.
if they
Yeah.
did. What I
Oh,
mean,
it would be so weird. What would they do? I don't know. Maybe
you're like,
pixelize his
wait,
face.
because couldn't this line of logic be like, well, Mad Men depicts misogyny, so we're gonna take those down because we don't want that
Let's
stuff on
just
our network.
erase the entire show.
Okay.
The whole show just disappears because Mad Men depicts misogyny, exactly. And I think people are just uncomfortable. And perhaps by people we really just mean, Twitterati, perhaps, who don't really count as people. I was looking at the news about Elon Musk possibly buying out Twitter,
Yeah, he's our
and I
new
thought
overlord on Twitter. Get used to
he's
it.
he's our new overlord. And I thought, well, maybe this it's not likely to change anything, but yeah, I think it's important also to not mistake Twitter responses for real life responses, but sometimes it's hard to know
Yeah,
where
especially because
people are actually coming from.
I agree. I think that you and I are often responding to the Twitter scandal of the week, in part because it does. I mean, it does find its way into big publications and
Like
like
news reports in the
yeah.
Times.
I mean, a lot of these people on Twitter are literally like major publications and writers who are sharing this stuff, and it's beyond just the like idiot with 3 followers saying some stupid shit. It begins to be, I don't know. That's part of what I think social media like can do is it both responds and drives the conversation into weird places. I mean,
That's just it.
one of the things that got us started, I think, just a couple weeks ago, you and I, Yasmin, thinking about a gender podcast was the Will Smith slap, which is like, to me, like the response to that on social media was a perfect example of like, I can't tell what's going on here. Like it really honestly was a paralyzing moment to me because I was just sort of like, what the fuck is everyone's? I don't know where I am on this. Like, I'm just completely overwhelmed by the onslaught of opinion here.
Yes, it was a weird moment. I will admit that I had an opinion when I saw it. Was a weird moment as it happened. We don't need to go into that because I think some of us didn't. Because if you were watching it on American television, you didn't actually hear him say what he said, and then you waited for Australian television to show you relay to you via sound what happened. So that was itself kind of bizarre. But yes, the whole, what is interesting, of course, there was how race and gender got mixed up because people were insisting, well, this is how Black men must, there was a certain cadre of people who were insisting that, well, this is how Black men must protect Black women. And then another part, including me saying, oh, shut the fuck up.
from other Black men, I guess. The marriage element, I thought, was what got me started, honestly. Was hearing all these people talking about, well, you got to defend your wife, and even the people
with a club.
Yeah, even the people who were like, well, I don't know, I don't condone any kind of slapping or violence, but you got to defend your wife. And I was like, what the fuck are we talking about here? Like, this
isn't
weird.
Even 1950. That's like the beginning of time with Neanderthals, walking around. I imagine sort of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 and all those men on all fours. With this gigantic TV screen perhaps behind them instead of that thing. Yeah. I know, right? Yeah. Like, what the fuck do you mean defending your wife? It brought out the most ridiculous aspects of so much about that incident. And it did, and I think this is where I wouldn't say social media is useful, but it does reveal perhaps some of the latent anxieties or not so latent anxieties, right? And conflicting emotions. And then what? Where are we now with the Will Smith thing? And
right. Yeah. What did it do for us? What did it produce?
What did it produce? It produced a lot of words out of me, but I don't know where those words go and whether they matter or not.
I remember I was really hyped up about it a few weeks ago. Now I'm like, I don't even remember what I was saying. I'll have to go back. I mean, I actually, to me, and this is why Twitter's weird to me, because I am a person who feels a lot of ways about things. You know what I mean? And I feel like you are too, Yasmin. That's definitely why I wanted to speak with you. It's like these aren't settled things that I just have like, oh, this is, and I've felt this way since I was 15 years old, and that's that. It's like, well, then you're not really evolving or growing.
Right.
And that's part of like Twitter is so ephemeral. Twitter is just like, oh, this is how I felt today. I can definitely go back and be like, holy shit, I can't believe I said that about Ukraine or Trump or Will Smith, whatever. Because it does sort of like put you into an emotional moment that you react to. I don't know about you. That's how it is for me.
Yeah, I think Twitter is, if we can all think about Twitter as being useful in that sense, in the sense that it's it's where you process perhaps your thoughts on something,
Rough
and that's
drafts.
fine.
Yeah.
Rough drafts, exactly, rough drafts. I will say I use it as a tool. I'm the queen of screenshots, so when I do my certain kinds of detective work,
Saving the receipts.
saving the receipts, man. I've got receipts up the yazoo for certain. I'm writing a somewhat, it won't be explosive, but it will be extremely revealing about an incident that happened last year. We'll say no more, as you know what I'm talking about. But I've been going through all the receipts, and I look at them and I think, you all are so stupid. Don't say certain things on social media. So I do think there is, yeah, it's the both, right? It's, yes, it's fine to articulate and just throw out your thoughts, but at the same time, if you're also using it to, say, for instance, drive bullying discourse against someone,
yeah,
I think that needs to be recorded and remembered, because there's an erasure,
I think I'm projecting a idyllic vision of what social
right.
media could be. Would be like a place where we're all working it out together, but it's not.
Right.
It's not used that way. It's used to people making declarative statements that are like, "This is truth. This is," and yeah, weaponized 100%. I mean,
Absolutely.
we haven't even talked lies, misinformation. I mean, there's all sorts of bullshit on there. It's like, it comes with it should come with a serious caveat about sort of what you're reading, but it's not taken that way. I mean, it's sort of a place where people actually try to have serious conversations about this stuff rather than open-ended things.
Yes, no, it's definitely about using misinformation to try and, frankly, in relation to the piece I'm writing, to try and ruin someone's life and career.
Well,
that's.
We'll get into that, and I mean the other part of it is getting back to marriage. I mean, and like, you created an organization called Against Equality that was sort of taking on gay marriage, but I think we should, when we're talking about Mad Men, we're like, there's the model, and like, I bring this up because I'm reading a lot about the Cold War right now, and like the period right after World War II, where there's all this excitement about the end of World War II in 1945, and then by 1950, everyone's at war again and hating communists, and like how that happened. But also this sort of like push for marriage, and particularly marriage about young people as a sort of social stability after World War II and the Great Depression, and the sort of like return to normalcy after those long periods of hell. Was driven by marriage, and a lot of it was the idea of, putting women and men into certain roles, but also creating stability among men and all these like veterans that had come back, and so you have the GI Bill that creates the suburbs and all that shit. So I hope we get to talk about some of that stuff too, because it feels like that. When I hear Tucker Carlson talking about tradition, and when I hear sort of like the right wing sort of wanting to get that back, that family back, it seems like that's part of what I hear.
Right. Just to clarify, I'm the co-founder of Against Equality. My friend and comrade Ryan Conrad. I know you know this, but I always try to give him, the credit as well. And he actually began the website. But Ryan, but yes. So AE is, it's interesting. Gay marriage, and I think we'll talk about that in the weeks and months to come. But yes, marriage as a kind of solidification of American identity for people who came back bruised and broken from the war. And the GI Bill being what it was, yes, we all know this, right? The history of suburbanization and the GI Bill, but also the fact that GI Bill, in terms of race, yes, there was gender, but then in terms of race, it excluded most Black veterans. And those benefits were not actually, there were some who benefited, but it was not open to many Black veterans. There's that. And the suburbanization. What is interesting about gay marriage, and what I find kind of, marriage is always about the state yoking women in particular to an economic system. That's what it's always been historically. And gay marriage was argued for in those exact same terms. So because it was supposedly between two men and two women, suddenly marriage, and this is what Against Equality was created to combat, because suddenly marriage was being projected as a liberatory phenomenon. So in other words, if only we could let men and women get married to, each other, men marry men and so on, they could then access healthcare. And what AE kept saying was, dude, that's wrong. We were supposed to have universal healthcare, right? So healthcare for all without marriage. But in terms of gender, what is interesting is that no one noticed, and AE kept saying this out loud, and we keep saying this out loud, which is, it is reaffirming a gendered role in marriage, but without it seeming that way. But for instance, even now, as you know, when you file income taxes, there's still primary and secondary. And, people in terms of immigration. So for instance, in immigration, there was supposedly a big breakthrough because now gay citizens and permanent residents can sponsor their same-sex partners. But in order to do that, in order to sponsor your partner, you have to be the primary care person, person earner, and that person has to be dependent on you. In much the same way that we had a 1950s housewife, right? Much the same way that Betty was dependent on Dawn. This person whom you bring into this country cannot, for instance, work even for a certain period. People don't understand this. People don't want to know this. But you literally actually cannot have your own independent income for a while.
Well, don't we all remember, and talk about pop culture, there was always plots when I was growing up about people marrying people for their green card, right? And I'm going to marry this man because I'm doing a favor for him so he can
there were movies about it.
Navigate the immigration system, and then we can throw in the rom-com on top of it. But yeah, it was taken for granted, this idea that marriage is a path to citizenship, right? To me, there's a lot to unpack there.
And is there anything sort of more devastating than to have to be yoked to someone for something as vital as your citizenship, your place, your literal place in the world, right? Where you put
citizenship
your foot down.
life or death, right?
It's life or death.
If you have a nation, we're talking now, the numbers are somewhere like 70, 80 million people who are in this quote-unquote refugee status around the world right now, people without a nation. And, to me, I'm like, those are the most fucked people on earth because they have no national infrastructure that's protecting them, right? And, that's brutal reality, but that's just the way fucking shit works. And to yoke marriage to that in the United States is that's the cookie, right? You want protection you want to be part of the gang, you want to be an American, then this is the path. That to me is present in a lot of different places, right? That sort of subtle ideological push towards making you into something that you're not.
Right.
I don't know.
And
it's a weird way of putting it, but I hope you know what I mean. Yeah.
No, I know what you mean. And it's also always gendered, because simply turning it into man plus man or woman plus woman doesn't divorce, to use no pun intended, doesn't divorce us, right, from the fact of the gendered material history on which marriage is based. So you can say man and man, but the fact remains that one man has to be in the subservient position, i.e. taking the position of the woman in the relationship.
Yeah, wasn't that the
economically?
Who's the woman and who's the man?
I was just going to say, and that's sexual, but it still, exactly. And that same dynamic plays out. Who's the man? It's actually a good question to ask. Who's the man and who's the woman in your relationship? The person with more money.
Yeah, and God, I'm hearing so many who wears the pants, who has the balls, who's the top, who's the bottom. There are so many fucking ways that we love to sort of express that hierarchy. But yeah, it's tough. Man, this is going to be fun, Yasmin. I'm really looking forward to this.
And we didn't even get to Tucker Carlson's balls.
Yeah, I know.
We don't have to.
We don't have to. But what?
I interrupted you as you were trying to say goodbye. Sorry.
No, I wasn't. I was just sort of. To me, this is an endless conversation. We're always just going to have to be all right, that's enough for now. Because Tucker Carlson's balls. What is that about? To me, part of it is saying that men used to be outside and their balls were exposed. They were out doing caveman shit, and so that made them tougher. But what Carlson is saying is that there's like a literal like drop, like a measurable drop in testosterone in American men. Yeah.
So my theory about Tucker Carlson is that he knows what he's talking. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
I don't think he's actually. I doubt that this is anything more than. I'm sure he does sincerely believe. Yes, a lot of
theater for clicks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's what it is. And I think the fact, so what happened was recently some friends and I thought, oh, we should, watch the documentary and talk about it. And then we realized the documentary isn't even out yet. Everyone's basically talking about this 2.5-minute trailer.
Yeah.
So imagine how much interest he has generated for a barely 3-minute trailer. Now imagine what's going to happen when the actual documentary, is set forth into the world. The guy knows what he's doing. So for all those reasons, I think, yes, we mentioned Tucker Carlson's balls. If those balls prove to be of any interest to us in the future, we shall talk about them.
Yeah.
But probably not.
Yeah.
Let them burn in hell.
Yeah, burn those balls. Tucker Carlson is, I think he's just an easy sort of like visible thing. It's an indication again of like the social media world. I mean, there's like the biggest, brightest flashing light that we all stare at for a second, and then there's another light that's flashing over here. Let's look at this one. Like there's a sort of attention deficit fucking insanity going on in social media. And like not only social media, but I feel like, there's a circus element to this, Mm-hmm. Tucker's talking about balls, so we're going to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump does the same thing. Trump is very skilled at like trolling the media, saying outlandish shit that gets attention, and we're kind of the dumb animals. We're falling for it every time.
And as someone who lives with 4 cats, that is you know how easy it is to run that little pointer. Not that your cat is dumb.
Yeah.
Maybe the little orange one, who's a dog.
Yeah, the little orange one is Bobby. He's getting old, and he's just a skinny old man now. But he's as you point, those orange tabbies, they're kind of assholes. He's like, I hate to say that, but you talk about gender and cats. Right. Who's the woman? Who's the man here? It's funny because it's another. I mean, it's stupid, but it's another place where I literally project this whole gender onto Bobby, where I'm like, oh, look, he's the little old man, because now he like all of a sudden he started like digging through the trash, like he just randomly out of nowhere after 15 years he's into digging through the trash, and I'm like, he's like that little old man you see in the subway.
Right.
Digging through the trash, and that's just what his life is now.
He's got his little ball of rubber bands.
Yes.
He's been collecting rubber bands.
Right. It's because his wife is gone, really. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. He's old and he's terrified he'll throw away the ball of rubber bands, because what else can he remember her by?
Oh, well,
I know.
Those kinds of things are important, honestly.
Yeah.
So I'm just really looking forward to this, Yasmin, because I know we have a million things to talk about. So I just want to let everyone know we will be putting up some gender trap episodes up over the course of the future, and to look for them on our Patreon page, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All right, thanks, folks. We'll talk to you again very soon.